In 1904, the regiment became the 3rd Light Horse and he became its commanding officer. In the same year, Sir Granville entered the New South Wales Legislative Assembly, representing Queanbeyan, before joining the still nascent federal parliament in 1911 as the member for North Sydney. In 1914, he volunteered for the front, telling his wife he couldn't look fellow Australians in the face if he stayed. In a sign of the respect he had won amongst his own constituents, the people of North Sydney came together to buy Sir Granville Old Bill, a black charger which, despite the homely name, was regarded as one of the best mounts in the Allied forces. Leading the 2nd Light Horse Brigade, Sir Granville was wounded twice at Gallipoli. He won the hearts of his men through his solidarity with them in the trenches, and when he protested successfully against an attack order which he knew would have been a bloody failure. In tribute, they named their position on Holly's Ridge, Ryer's Post. In 1916, Granville's 2nd Brigade was incorporated into the Anzac Mounted Division, and with this division, Sir Granville took part in the Battle of Beersheba, seizing the Hebron Road. In a letter home, Sir Granville told the story of the charge his own men made through an enemy camp and in pursuit of Turkish cavalry and guns. In his book Beersheba, the journalist Paul Daly wrote that Sir Granville was, and I quote, forged a reputation as one of his country's most fearless soldiers and finest leaders of men. Another predecessor of mine comes into the story here. Joe Hockey's grandfather and namesake, Joseph Hockadonian, was appointed Deputy Town Clerk of Beersheba after the Allied victory. Sir Granville continued to serve until the armistice and was decorated several times. I want to particularly pay tribute to his honour and humanity towards prisoners, on one occasion allowing 5,000 Turkish prisoners to keep their arms and to bivouac with his own soldiers to protect them from the anger of local Allied troops. After the war, Sir Granville and the Light Horse returned to Sydney to a rapturous welcome. Some have estimated that 200,000 Australians waited the docks for their arrival. I suspect no current politician would receive such a welcome on returning to their electorate. Back in Parliament, Sir Granville served as Assistant Minister for Defence from 1920 to 21. In 1922, when Bendigo was at risk, he gave up his seat for Billy Hughes. Sir Granville himself was moved to the newly created seat of Warringah and became its first member. In 1927, Sir Granville became High Commissioner to London, representing Australia at the League of Nations in Geneva as well. He passed away in 1937 and was buried in his hometown, where his family still lives. Earlier today, I had the pleasure of meeting with his great-grandson, Xander Ryrie, who followed the example of Sir Granville and served in the Australian Army for several years. His own service took him in Sir Granville's footsteps as a peacekeeper on the Israeli-Egyptian border, wearing the blue cap. Granville Ryrie was a man who served North Sydney and who served his country with courage and honesty and with a sense of the value of each Australian. He showed an interest in Indigenous Australians when few did, and he always stood beside the soldiers he led in several wars, as his wounds bore witness to. He was not the only North Sydney resident to show such qualities when their fellow Australians needed it, but he is representative of them all. In paying honour to him today, I do so with a salute to the thousands of Australians who marched or rode beside him. We shall never forget their service to our nation.
The member for Blair. Speaker, Shane Newman's incompetence was on full display during Senate estimates this week. The minister's fires run wide and deep when it comes to managing the offshore processing centres in Manasol and Nauru, or for his failure to secure other third country resettlement arrangements for eligible refugees. The Manasol and RPC will close on the 31st of October as a result of a ruling of the Papua New Guinea Supreme Court and the agreement with the Papua New Guinea government. The Department of Immigration and Border Protection confirmed during Senate estimates that alternative accommodation arrangements for refugees won't be completed until the 29th of October, only 2 days prior to the closure of Manasol and RPC. Contracts worth between an estimated $150 and $250 million will be undertaken to provide basic services for refugees in PNG after the 31st of October. But these contracts have yet to be signed. I emphasise the word estimated because that's the closest thing to a guarantee the Immigration Minister's Department could provide. It's not as if these issues have snuck up on the government. For months now, the Immigration Minister has been unclear and unwilling to explain Australia's involvement in offering support to refugees, and the PNG government, after the 31st of October, has left it to the very last minute. The closure of Manus Island RPC was confirmed by both the Prime Minister of Australia and the Prime Minister of Papua New Guinea in April this year. I quote the Australian from the 8th of April. Neither leader signalled any plan to find an alternative resettlement option for those who were not sent to the US under the refugee rearrangements that they had. It's clear the Immigration Minister should have made securing third country resettlement options apart from the US a priority since he became the Immigration Minister in 2014. Instead, we see he's left his department to scramble in the final weeks of the closure of the Manus Island RPC. Manus Island and Nauru were set up as regional transit facilities for processing by labour, but they've become places of indefinite detention by government in its 5th year of operation and governance. Labor strongly supports the US refugee resettlement agreement, and we thank the US for what they're doing. In a similar fashion to the contracts for PNG, it was revealed during Senate estimates that contracts for services in Nauru RPC after the 31st of October have not yet been finalised. The Immigration Minister needs to secure and ensure health services and welfare services for those in Nauru will be delivered when the current contractors pull out. A letter of intent was issued on the 28th of September for a company to take over these services, but that falls short of a contract. When it comes to a suitable contractor being selected, a limited tender process was run by the Immigration Minister's department. Senate estimates confirmed it was well and truly limited, with only one contractor considered. And that company has no experience in delivering welfare services and limited experience in delivering garrison services. This flies entirely in the face of recommendations from the Auditor General in the report Offshore Processing Centres in Nauru and Papua New Guinea, Procurement of Garrison Support and Welfare Services, which recommended, I quote, the ANAO report read, of most concern is the Department's management of processes for contract consolidation in the open tender. There was no open tender to ensure ongoing services in Nauru were secured, no value for money in terms of consideration, or even if basic service delivery standards will be met. Another case of too little, too late in terms of the Immigration Minister's last-minute plan to transfer refugees from Manus Island to Nauru. Only 2 eligible refugees have expressed interest in the transfer. What the Minister needs to do is find other third country arrangements other than the US. Senate estimates also confirms that a partner is yet to replace the Chief Medical Officer and Surgeon General following his resignation months ago. This means thousands of people across Australia's onshore and offshore immigration network are still without an advocate to ensure medical care is based on the best medical advice. The Secretary of the Department couldn't even remember he briefed the Immigration Minister, his own minister, about the resignation of the Chief Medical Officer. Most Australians would expect a boss to know when one of their most senior employees has resigned, but apparently it's a different set of standards for the Immigration Minister. Australia is better than an incompetent minister who can't even secure the cyber safety of his own department. It should have been compliant with the top 4 mitigation strategies by June 2014. The government should do much better than this.
Has concluded, and I call the member for Chisholm.
Thank you.
Julia Banks.
I rise today to talk about marriage equality. I'm sure I'm not the only person in Australia who's enjoyed that wonderful feeling of a belly laugh brought on by watching Magda Zabansky herself or in character mode. Magda has made me laugh so many times over the years, and recently she made me cry. This happened when she told the story of her friend with a cancer diagnosis who was denied being with her same-sex partner of many years during a treatment as she wasn't regarded as next of kin. I cried not only for her friend but for all those Australians who would have similar experiences. These people who in 10, 20 or 30 years' time may have stories like Magda Zabansky's friend, and whose stories will be depicted in movies in years to come, and we will all wonder why we hadn't thought of this earlier. Well, 2017 is the year when we can make this change and stop any more of these experiences happening to future generations of Australians. Mr. Speaker, in my late 20s, I was told by a doctor that I had cancer. They didn't know if it was cancer A or cancer B. If it was cancer A, it would be aggressive and terminal. Cancer B, on the other hand, was the best cancer to have, totally curable. It turned out to be cancer B, but they wouldn't know which it was until I had surgery in 10 days' time. The darkest 10 days of my life, but also the most loving. Why? Because during that time, I had love and family all around me. Specifically during that time, my partner and wife was my rock and my lifeline. And importantly, during that time, he asked me to marry him. My darkest hours became brighter simply by looking forward to a commitment of marriage. I felt safe, secure, loved and courageous. When I heard Magda's story, I despaired. I despaired because I simply felt it's not fair. It's not fair that two loving people cannot get married in our great country, that two loving people are not able to have the equal rights at law that millions of Australians currently enjoy in their committed loving marriages. Some will say it's courageous and risky being so vociferous in supporting marriage equality as an MP of a marginal seat. Fighting for marriage equality is not about political courage. Rather, it's about standing for equality for all, regardless of their gender, race, sexuality or ethnicity. I personally promised hundreds of people before the election that under the Turnbull government we would ensure that all Australians would have a right to have their say on this issue, that their vote would count as much as mine. We have maintained the integrity of that promise to the Australian people. Australians are decent people and known around the world for their sense of humour, goodwill and camaraderie towards others. Respectful debate is the cornerstone of our democracy. Telling Australians how to vote is not the way to go, and some have done a disservice to their cause by their behaviour and overreaching statements. However, a yes vote is an acknowledgement that social mores change and should be reflected in that change to the law. Many predict the no vote will win because young voters who are more likely to vote yes would not post their vote, not being the postal generation. People said things such as they'll only do things online or on their mobile phones. I've never bought into these views. Being the technological generation doesn't make young people complacent and not passionate about issues. Young Australians are making their vote count. They are the future. Then there is the argument in the No campaign, which I find personally disturbing, namely that only a marriage between a man and a woman will ensure the protection of children. Children need two things in life, Mr. Speaker: love and stability. Early in my legal career, when I practiced in family law, I saw firsthand that love and stability is not automatically afforded to children simply because they have a mother and a father. Love and stability are being provided to Australian children all over the country right now. The presence of love and stability is not limited to traditional nuclear families like my family. Rather, it's in the homes of single parents, widows, divorced and separated parents, same-sex parents, grandparents, aunties, uncles and special friends, regardless of their gender or sexuality. Marriage equality is about equality before the law. It's about fairness. It's about love and family. I hope that as Australians, when we watch that movie in the future, that all yes voters will feel that in 2017 they made their contribution to a fair, equal and modern Australia. I thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The member for Lyons.
Thank Brian Mitchell.
Before I begin, I'd like to thank the member for Chisholm. It was a great speech, and I'd like to associate myself with her remarks. Speaker, Rebecca White has been the leader of the Labor Party in Tasmania since March this year, and if all goes as hoped, by March next year, she will be our state's next Premier. Since taking on the leadership, following the dignified and selfless retirement of Brian Green, Rebecca has traversed the state listening to Tasmanians. The state election is due by March, but could come any time. Rebecca White and the Tasmanian Labor team is ready for an election whenever Liberal Premier Will Hodgman can find the courage to call one. Labor has the policies and the people to deliver a strong and effective majority Labor government, one that will focus on key services such as health and education while continuing to grow our state's economy. Rebecca has represented the state seat of Lyons since 2010. I was delighted to have played a part in her campaign long before I came to this place, and she has been a great strength to me as I serve our common constituents at the federal level. In just the past few months, Rebecca and her team have announced plans for Lyons, including a pledge to fix a notorious intersection on Bass Highway at Christmas Hills near Deloraine, and a pledge to invest $1 million in mountain biking tourism in St Helens. Statewide, the big issue is undoubtedly health, an area that has been completely mismanaged by the Liberals at both the state and federal levels. Ambulance ramping is out of control, we have ongoing bed shortages, and people with mental illness are simply being shut out of access to quality care. I don't pretend that health is an easy policy area. It is diabolically difficult managing competing needs within a limited budget. But it has to be said that the Tasmanian Health Minister, Michael Ferguson, a former Liberal member of this place, has been an unmitigated disaster. Like so many of his colleagues, he puts ideology before practicality. He puts dollars before care. A Rebecca White Tasmanian Labor government will invest an extra $88 million over 3 years into our state's struggling health system. Community nurses and health worker numbers will be increased, and hospitals will run over 7 days a week. This will keep people closer to their families when they need weekend and ongoing treatment. Now, the federal government recently ripped funding from well-supported and popular regional preventative health programs, redirecting it to chronic care. This was appallingly handled with no consultation and a haphazard changeover. I am yet to be convinced that the change has been for the better. The preventative programs kept people, particularly older people, happy and active within their local communities and kept them out of hospital. I think it's a terrible shame that the Liberals have axed those valuable programs. Labor has listened to regional communities and in government will move to commit more resources to preventative care models. With Rebecca White as Premier, 2 additional ambulance crews and 2 trucks will also hit the road to get Tasmanians treated faster. And I should note, Speaker, that Rebecca and I have both been working in recent months to secure funding commitments for Rural Alive and Well, based in Oatlands and our electorate, and I am pleased to see today that the federal government has provided a 1-year lifeline to this vital outreach service. I would have liked to have seen a 3-year commitment, but 1 year is better than nothing. I certainly do not want to see these 1-year commitments become the norm. They make it impossible for organisations to plan, and they fuel fear and insecurity within the workforce and amongst vulnerable clients. Rebecca and her team have also announced wider policies, including the rollout of 6 new child and family centres across the state to support families and nurture young children. School starting ages will stay where they are. And there's also a commitment to ensure that people can pay their utilities bills in instalments without financial penalty, and a public commitment to agriculture and national parks. And we both share a commitment to TAFE as a pillar of vocational training. Rebecca is a hard-working and compassionate Labor leader with a steely determination to achieve practical results. And she understands regional communities in particular, because likely she lives in one. It brings a perspective to her policy suite that can be difficult to fathom when you live in a nice house in the middle of the city, surrounded by amenities and services. I know Rebecca White well. I consider her a very good friend, and Tasmania will be well served by Rebecca White, the majority state Labor government, at the next election in March. Thank you.
The member for Mellie.
Andrew Broad.
I wish to update the House on the strategic plan that we have been implementing in the township of Mildura. And prosperity doesn't just happen, it actually as a result of choices that we make. Firstly, the first thing this federal government has done since we've come into power is put some common sense back into water policy. We've made it clear that we are not going to participate in buybacks. We wanted to give confidence to irrigators that water is going to be there and available for them to irrigate. The second thing that the federal government has done is delivered $103 million for the Sunraysia modernisation project, which has been built and has now put a lot of the earthen channels into pipes and has driven efficiency and confidence in the region. We are also advocating stage 2 of the Sunraysia modernisation program to expand the irrigation footprint by a further 25%. The other thing we've done is put on-farm tax deductibility to irrigation infrastructure, as well as a $20,000 instant tax write-offs. This has meant that not only have we built infrastructure, but agriculturalists and horticulturalists have brought infrastructure on their own farms. The fourth thing we've done is develop 3 free trade agreements with China, Korea and Japan. The prosperity that has come out of that has been phenomenal. It has driven over $1 billion of additional money to this community and has really set us up for the future. But of course we've got to be able to get the product to the market. And the federal government has contributed $240 million to build the Murray Basin Rail Project. That's with $200 million from the state government, so a $440 million project to now have Victoria's busiest freight line taking all the horticultural products we produce to the marketplace.
But of course, it continues on. If you're going to have cutting-edge producers, you need to have NBN, and we now have 11 NBN towers built around the township of Mildura. We are building the building blocks for prosperity. The next thing we have done, which we will be opening in a week's time, is upgrade the Mildura runway, which has cost the federal government $10 million and a $25 million upgrade. We now have 737s daily coming into Mildura and 140 commercial flights a week. You can fly direct to Sydney, Adelaide, Broken Hill, Melbourne, and perhaps in the future Brisbane. This opens up us to the business community. Of course, we wanted to make Mildura a great place to live, and also in a week's time we'll be opening the $18 million Mildura waterfront. A beautiful place to walk down on the water, and it means that we are investing in the quality of life in our regions. We do want to build stage 2 of the irrigation infrastructure. We believe there's a strong future here. We want to expand it. Additionally, on top of that, we are working on the Mildura Ready, Future Ready project. This is a strategic vision of the council where they need to invest in some sporting precincts. Our sporting precinct is full. It needs some significant upgrades, and I'll be certainly fighting for $10 million to build part of the Mildura South Sports Precinct in the next round of the Building Better Regions Fund. The other thing that has been a success for our community, which is the largest Indigenous community in the electorate of Mallee, the largest Indigenous community in the state of Victoria, is we've had Indigenous employment programs. One of the things you will not see in Mildura is people in Indigenous culture sitting on the river drinking alcohol. We have people actively engaged in getting people work. That we have businesses that are very proactive in making sure they provide culturally sensitive workplaces. And we want to make sure that even though our community has prosperity, we want to ensure that prosperity is shared among everyone and that no one's left behind. The things that are building the prosperity in the town have been quite strategic, Mr. Speaker. It hasn't been an accident, and it's been really about building those key infrastructures, and when you knit them all together, you are taking the products you produce to the market, you're opening up opportunities to the world, you're ensuring that there's first-rate telecommunications, you're ensuring that we have a place where people want to live. And I just want to say to the people of Mildura that the National Party have delivered for you. Sometimes people say in Mildura they feel like they miss out, and clearly when I've outlined some of their federal government expenditure that goes in this town, they haven't missed out. But they do sometimes feel, Mr. Speaker, that because they are the furthest point from the capital of the state of Victoria, they're the furthest point from Melbourne, they believe at times they miss out. But I believe when we work together, when we fight together and we put the case, we should be very proud of what we've achieved in this small town. Mildura is a great inland city. I know Minister Taylor is here, and I hope that he sees that there is a long future for our inland cities. Unfortunately, it doesn't fit in your remap. There's only 52,000. It's not 80,000 yet. But I believe there's a strong future here, and we'll continue to advocate for good outcomes for this town.
The House stands adjourned until Monday, 27th November at 10 a.m.
So that's all from us for this week. Handing you over to Tracy Holmes, who's standing by with a full news bulletin on ABC News on Radio.
And we'd like to welcome back our analogue listeners from proceedings at Parliament House in Canberra. You've joined us just in time for a news update. Tracy Holmes with you this afternoon. Eastern Daylight Time is 5 o'clock, and South Australia 4:30, Queensland 4 o'clock, the Northern Territory 3.
ABC News.
The Prime Minister is applauding a media advisor's decision to resign after he tipped the media off about police raids at the Australian Workers' Union offices in Sydney and Melbourne. The Employment Minister, Michaelia Cash, told Parliament her office wasn't involved before her staffer admitted he did alert the press. He's now stood down, and Labor is calling for Senator Cash to quit also. Malcolm Turnbull has told Question Time the staff member needed to resign.
A very, very wrong, improper act of indiscretion, and he was wrong to do what he admitted to, but he was right to resign.
There's been an angry reaction to the federal government's decision to dump a referendum proposal to create a new Indigenous advisory body. Indigenous Affairs correspondent Bridget Brennan reports.
Federal Cabinet is not supporting an idea to enshrine an Indigenous advisory body in the Constitution. The Uluru Constitutional Summit endorsed the idea in May, and it was the key recommendation from the Referendum Council, which was commissioned by the government to consult with Indigenous Australians. Josie Crawshaw was a delegate at Uluru, and she says she's upset.
They've just wasted 10 years of a conversation and tens of millions of dollars to actually just shelve it and flush it down the toilet.
The government is yet to say whether it may proceed with a separate proposal on constitutional recognition.
The Foreign Affairs Department has revealed Australian diplomats attempt to communicate with North Korea each month, usually by fax. Defence reporter Andrew Green has the story.
Reaching out to the world's most isolated country can be extremely difficult, so Australian diplomats often have to rely on archaic methods. At a Senate estimates hearing, DPAT Secretary Frances Adamson has given an insight into how her department attempts to communicate with Kim Jong-un's regime.
There are communications of various kinds. Often it has to be sent by fax machine and occasionally by post.
The department says it usually communicates with Pyongyang every month or two about one thing or another. Andrew Green, ABC News, Canberra.
The Tasmanian Premier is yet to commit to the state opting into a Commonwealth redress scheme for victims of institutional abuse. The federal government has introduced a bill for the scheme to provide victims with up to $150,000 in compensation and is urging states and territories to sign up as well. Tasmania ran a compensation scheme for people abused while in state care for 10 years until 2013, delivering $54 million in ex gratia payments. The Premier, Will Hodgman, says he won't rule out joining the Commonwealth scheme, but wants more detail.
Well, it's a complicated issue when some states, as Tasmania has already had schemes to support victims, other states haven't. So there's no one-size-fits-all, and there are budget implications there.
Police have arrested 3 people in Victoria after a body was found in a shallow grave on the Mornington Peninsula. Elias Kluwer has more.
When we first discovered this news on Monday morning that the body had been found on Sunday evening, what we first noticed in Tyabb, it's about 55 kilometres outside of Melbourne, is just the isolated nature of the property. It was completely vacated. It's unclear as to how long it had been vacated for, but a neighbour had told us that the particular derelict property in which the man was found had been unknown to the community, and that basically he didn't ask questions, and that a lot of mysterious things had been happening there. But police were very tight-lipped as to the person who was found and who discovered it until yesterday, when we discovered that it was 39-year-old Jade Goodwin who was the man buried in that grave. And then this afternoon they revealed that 3 people had been arrested over the past 3 days.
In South Australia, the Dignity Party says the complete rollout of the NDIS in the state by mid-next year is likely to be delayed due to an increasing backlog of cases. South Australia is behind its quarterly target for people who should be on the NDIS by almost 800. Dignity MLC Kelly Vincent says she'd had calls for months from parents who say their children are waiting up to a year for planning appointments. She says it will further delay the adult phase of the scheme, which began in June. Ms Vincent says the state government needs to modify its bilateral agreements with the Commonwealth.
Almost as soon as the rollout began, concerns about the rollout became very, very evident. And I think given the fact that we are 3 years, 4 years into the rollout and we're still receiving calls every day, shows very clearly that the federal and state government need to put their egos aside and work side by side on this.
Philippines President Rodrigo Duterte has told the European Union to go to hell if it will not accept his explanation on the thousands of killings blamed on his drug war. Shirley Escalante reports.
President Duterte made the comments after an EU report showed the human rights situation in the Philippines has worsened. He said critics focused on the number of deaths in his drug campaign and not on the reasons behind the killings. The report claims the human rights situation in the Philippines deteriorated in the second half of 2016 when Mr. Duterte launched his war on drugs. The Duterte administration said this was a rehash of criticisms and refused to accept development aid from the EU. Shirley Escalante, Manila.
Polling stations have opened for the rerun of Kenya's presidential election. Africa correspondent Sally Sara reports.
Tight security is in place for the controversial ballot as votes are cast at more than 40,000 polling stations. Opposition candidate Raila Odinga is urging his supporters to boycott. Mr Odinga says the election will not be credible due to a lack of reform of the Electoral Commission. The rerun was ordered by the Supreme Court after it annulled the results of the original poll in August because of irregularities. Sally Sarah, ABC News, Nairobi.
Time to check in with finance and our Comsec market analyst Tom Petrosky. Hi, Tom.
Good afternoon, Tracy.
The ASX 200 struggling to move ahead with banks weighing on the market today.
That was the theme today. The market was down by about 20 points in early trade, and banks were the main liability. And the reason being is that investors seem to take a dim view of the ANZ's full-year result. It was actually quite good. It was in line with the market's expectations. Full-year cash profit up by 18% to $6.9 billion. If there was a sticking point, it might have been that the net interest margin, which is obviously a very important part of the way a bank operates, the difference between where a lender borrows money and then lends it out. That was a bit lower than what the market had anticipated, but the shares were down quite sharply initially, but then we saw the rest of the banks recover. They all finished higher, but the ANZ was still down by just over 1%, so that's where the difference was made in the market. Mining stocks were generally weaker today as well when it came to iron ore. Fortescue Metals was down by about 3.5%.
Several companies had updates today. Any standouts?
Yeah, there was a bit of a customer-facing theme as far as today was concerned. Qantas indicated that they could be running into some more challenges in the second half of the year through potentially higher fuel costs and